Hello, everyone. My name is John Price from America's Market Intelligence, and I'm very pleased to be here. I thank Ryerson for the invitation and very pleased to be involved in this year's Engage conference. I'm coming to you from Miami, but I work with a firm that operates a lot in Mexico, and the issue of nearshoring is very much front and center in the work we do with our clients. So I want to share with you our outlook on nearshoring, what is driving it, what its opportunities and challenges hold to those contemplating Mexico as a nearshoring destination, and what the long-term future looks like for nearshoring in Mexico. So with your permission, I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint presentation that will provide some complementary data as I walk through my presentation. Very quickly, who we are. We are a firm that helps investors understand Latin America, answer significant questions they have before they make market moves in the region. We've been doing that for the last 30 years. In fact, we began in Mexico. Some of the questions we help companies answer are around their strategy, who they should work with in the marketplace, where they should first act in the marketplace, and some of the companies we've helped over the years with these kind of strategic decisions. This is our legal notice. Of course, anything that I share with you should be taken in conjunction with other advice that you receive. Now, let's start with what is driving the nearshore phenomena. And we're really talking about the movement of assembly operations from China in particular to Mexico and other destinations around the world, but we're most interested in Mexico today. But it's important to note that Mexico must compete with other parts of the world to attract that kind of investment. The first thing that people are aware of, I think conceptually, but the data is quite compelling, and that is that China's aging population, really the population under the age of 50, which almost all manufacturing jobs are filled by, began shrinking some time ago, about 14 years ago, and continues to shrink. And this is being a material impact for China's ability to continue to attract labor at competitive prices. And in fact, the nearshoring phenomena, or the exodus of assembly operations from Mexico or from China, began long before the bilateral relationships between China and the U.S. became more conflictive, and it really is driven by demographics at the end of the day. When we look at comparative labor costs, you really begin to see that around the same time that China's population under 50 began to shrink around 2007, you see that the gradual increase in labor costs in China, represented here by the checkered line, really begin to increase at a more accelerated pace. And this has become quite acute in recent years, whereas the lines of its competitor countries, countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Mexico, have also increased, but a much more moderate level. And today, the variable cost of Chinese manufacturing labor is about 3.5 times that of Mexico. Now, that doesn't mean that all factories in China are being disassembled and shipped abroad, but what it does mean is that new factories that are considering outsourcing in the hopes of reaching the US or European or other markets through cheap labor are less and less likely to choose China and more likely to choose other locations. And Mexico, in spite of its success in export growth into the US, has been able to maintain relatively low labor costs. And that's really a function of its own demographics, where it continues to produce working age people. That won't last forever, but it has been the case in recent years, as well as just the currency, which has continued to lose value versus the dollar, and therefore has maintained the costs in dollars at a relatively stable rate. If we, another important factor as to why nearsourcing is an increasing phenomena, we also have to look at the U.S. labor pool. U.S. manufacturing has changed significantly over the years. The U.S. has or used to produce about 25 to 30% of the world's manufacturing value. That has come down a little bit. But more importantly, the number of people employed, which is established here as the blue line or the blue solid graph, has dropped. And it's dropped for a couple of reasons. One is the continued automation and modernization of manufacturing techniques in the United States. Although not as automated or roboticized as, say, manufacturing in Germany or Japan, it nonetheless has modernized with time, and that requires less labor input. And the type of labor input it needs tends to be more and more educated, more and more trained, which makes it tougher to recruit those kinds of people. Meanwhile, the production index, that is the amount of goods being produced, continues to go up. This has become a challenge in the United States, in part because if you look at the United States and where is the population growth in the United States, it tends to be in states that do not have a manufacturing history. So the most manufacturing-oriented states, like the so-called Rust Belt states, their population growth has been very moderate. They still, to this day, tend to lose more people moving to other parts of the country than gain net migration within the United States. So that has made it challenging. As a result, some U.S. manufacturers have moved to southern states where there's more population and generally lower costs of labor. And others have moved abroad. And obviously some of them moved to China and some of them moved to Mexico and elsewhere. But the fact is that the need for nearshoring begins in the United States. And if you look at the population growth in the United States, the native population growth, i.e. American-born population, their birth rates have continued to decline. And like I said, particularly in manufacturing states, but also the immigration patterns into the United States, which have enabled the country as a whole to continue growing its population. They do not tend to come from a manufacturing background. And they don't tend to necessarily migrate to the traditional manufacturing states. So this has created a real labor shortage in the United States. And starting really back around the same time as China was joining the sort of international economy around 2000, and about the time that interest in Mexico also began to increase from an American perspective. If we look at the relationship over time between the United States and China, we see a relationship that began, obviously it dates back further, and everybody's familiar with the famous Nixon visit to China, which was a geopolitical move to bring China, even though it was ostensibly a communist nation, to bring it on side as a sort of a way of pressuring the Russians. But the relationship took on a more commercial face around 2000 when trade relations between China and the United States began to normalize. And that meant that China was treated as a market economy, which meant that it was, and China also joined a number of multilateral trade agreements around that time. And this really provided a couple of things. Number one, it made it tougher to throw up non-tariff barriers against Chinese products entering countries. And it also gave manufacturers from abroad, especially the United States, a much higher level of confidence that they would continue to enjoy access to the U.S. consumer, even though their product was manufactured in China. This early sort of honeymoon stage included collaboration diplomatically with China on what were deemed as rogue states at the time: Sudan, North Korea, and Iran. And Chinese diplomatic pressure in those corridors was absolutely instrumental in helping U.S. Advance its interests. By 2008, China had become the largest foreign creditor to the United States, surpassing Japan. And this was particularly the case in Chinese purchase of treasury bonds. And that gave, over time, China significant leverage in its bilateral relations and overcoming tensions with the Americans. By 2010, China became the second largest economy. And that was an ostensible threat to Americans and to the political class in the United States, who really sort of began to change its thinking about China as a place where, well, we can take advantage of cheap labor, as a place that can serve our interest geopolitically, to one of a economic rival. By 2012, of course, Xi Jinping was elected, and that was significant in terms of changing the narrative in China. Without going into too much detail about Xi, his outlook, his view of the world as the leader of China was very different than his predecessors. And he was much more interested in a sort of China first foreign relations policy. And that began to further the sort of apprehension about China in Washington. By 2018, Trump being in office for almost 2 years, there was significant pressure, not just from his administration, but also from Congress, to apply tariffs against China on certain products. And the way that was managed and the discord that it created only escalated sort of distrust and basically created a bit of a trade war between the two countries. 2019, U.S. labeled China a currency manipulator, something they'd been threatening to do for several years. Trump also signed an agreement in explicit support of Hong Kong protesters, which was something that is seemingly not unimportant from a commercial standpoint, but really was grating to the relations with China. The 2020 COVID outbreak in Wuhan, and the sort of lack of transparency around that caused another level of distrust that only added to this sort of trade-based dispute. There was consulate closures in both sides. Pompeo at the time deemed the relationship a failure, which is the kind of language you don't normally hear in such an important bilateral relationship. When Biden was elected, many of the China watchers hoped that there would be somehow a return to pre-Trump relations with China, but that didn't really happen. Biden is more of a protectionist than I think a lot of people realized, and he continued to include most of the Trump administration initiated tariffs. He also, through pressures on the administration from the Democrats, sort of outed the Chinese on its abuses of the Uyghurs and calling it genocide. The U.S. a year later urged NATO or convinced NATO to declare China a security challenge. Again, diplomatic language, but again, another effort to sort of isolate or contain China. In 2022, the U.S. imposed, as did many other countries, imposed diplomatic boycott of Olympics, which didn't really stop athletes from going, but basically kept government officials from going to the Olympics. And again, it was another sort of slap in the face from the Chinese point of view. Of course, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan caused significant noise in Beijing. And more recently, the U.S. imposed restrictions on China's computer chip industry in defense of its own. But again, that has proven to be quite costly to the Chinese. More recently, Xi and Biden met to try to cool tensions, and I think succeeded in doing a little bit. But the bottom line here is this is a relationship that has evolved from one of very much unequal partners to very much two economic rivals. And the political fallout of that, of course, has been trade disputes, and that has raised a level of uncertainty for manufacturers. It's been well documented that Apple Computers, through its relationship with Foxconn, has 85% of its manufacturing base, installed base in China. And that kind of exposure has really sent waves of new thinking through American manufacturing that they need to better balance their global manufacturing geography. And so this is all part of what's been pushing assembly operations out of China. It began really as a way to save money because of rising labor costs, but also it took on significant political risk in more recent years. Now, if you compare the U.S. engagement with China and that with Mexico on a sort of economic point of view, Chinese manufacturing or exports still take a larger share of U.S. imports than Mexico does, but Mexico's share has increased over the last 10 years, whereas China's has slightly decreased, particularly in the last, since those Trump administration tariffs were put in place. But more importantly, when you talk to manufacturers, U.S. manufacturers, they'll tell you that their Chinese operations are far less profitable than their Mexican operations. And that might just be because of the elevated cost of labor, but I think it also has to do with just the non-tariff barriers they find in China, the difficulty in penetrating the marketplace, and the extra level of bureaucracy when it comes to establishing their businesses. Whereas in Mexico, the U.S. is still the largest foreign direct investor in the country, and American businesses have always done very well. Mexico has always been one of the most profitable markets for them, whether it's used as a manufacturing base or as a marketplace. And so there's a greater degree of comfort, not to mention, of course, the time zone difference is a lot easier to manage, and the linguistic difference. When we look, in fact, a little closer at Mexican and American relationship, there's a lot there to provide a degree of certainty that does not exist in the bilateral relationships with China. The first, of course, is the legal certainty provided by the USMCA, formerly known as NAFTA. And it was quite a revolutionary trade agreement at the time, in that it expanded well beyond just how products were taxed and looked at legal protections associated with investing in each other's countries. So there's a greater degree of investor protection against unfair treatment, nationalization, but also there should be unfettered access to sell from a partner country to the other country's government through their procurement, and not being discriminated as a foreign supplier. That hasn't always stood up, but there is at least a arbitration body through which complaints can be fielded and dealt with, and relatively quickly dealt with, much faster than in the sort of international courts, where these things are often disputed between countries that don't have a trade agreement like USMCA. Now, there are disputes, and there have been plenty of disputes over the years between Mexico and the United States, but they have not unwound their relationship, in part because the mechanism exists for essentially a supranational judicial body to decide on these things. And that has been absolutely essential, not just to protect U.S. interests, but also to protect Canadian and Mexican interests when they felt they were being bullied by sort of American, when America from time to time sort of flirts with its own protectionist political instincts. And so it has been a very useful legal framework through which a commercial relationship could deepen. The other thing is that this is such a big economic relationships. In many ways, it's too big to fail. As disruptive as bilateral trade tensions have been with China, they would be even greater with Mexico, just because of the degree of American investment over the years, of the last 50 years in Mexico. And the U.S. is the largest foreign investor by far in Mexico. It's also Mexico's largest export customer. And Mexico is the United States' second largest export customer, just behind Canada, and by far the largest foreign customer of U.S. agricultural goods. And of course, given the political weight of the agricultural industry in the United States, the number of states that are affected by that, and their ability to marshal political leverage in Washington has also been instrumental at times at keeping this relationship healthy. And Mexico is home to more U.S.-owned manufacturing capacity than any other country. So even though the output out of China is greater, what is owned by American interests in China is far less than in Mexico. Now, of course, those are the economic reasonings. There's also a lot of cultural and social ties between these two countries. There's over 35 million Mexican descendant people living in the United States. And these people, as they've gotten older and have those who cross the border illegally have legalized, they've become more and more involved in U.S. domestic politics. And of course, the U.S., like most countries, a lot of its foreign relations are driven or at least influenced by U.S. domestic political interests. And so having such a large voter base, in the United States certainly helps to keep things from severing ties between these two countries. Mexico is also, I believe Mexico City is the largest U.S. embassy in the world. And when you count up the different consulates and the total investment made by the U.S. government diplomatically in Mexico, it's about the third largest of any country in the world. And of course, Spanish is the second most spoken language in the United States, and English in Mexico. So these are two countries that understand each other, that find it relatively easy to do business with each other. And that, of course, is in contrast to China and other countries around the world. Now, that's the good news. There are, of course, some obstacles that people need to be aware of. And the first and most sort of complicated obstacle has to do with energy. This rather noisy looking map, if you look for the red portions, these are portions of Mexico where there is a underinvestment or insufficient investment in both electrical generation and, more importantly, in electrical transmission. And this is an issue that Mexico has dealt with for a long time. This is a country that, going back to 1936, essentially nationalized its oil industry and subsequently its electricity generation and distribution industry, such that two state-controlled entities, CFE, Comisión Federal de Electricidad, which takes care of all the power issues, and Pemex, the nationalized oil company, these have been huge operations that have been essentially the cornerstone of the Mexican government's economic power and a very important instrument of its political power. Now, years ago, people began to realize, as Mexico was attracting more and more manufacturing assembly operations in its northern states, that there was going to be an issue with electricity. Most of Mexico's energy deposits are found in the southeast portion of the country, which is a long way from Baja California, for instance. And to transmit electricity that is generated by smokestack or oil-based bunker fuel generation in southeastern Mexico all the way to the northeast was costly and required, constantly modernizing transmission infrastructure. This came to a head about 10 years ago when the private sector really put pressure on the government, said, look, you've got to do something about this. And there had been different governments since the PRI that had been in power for 70 years. Their sort of monopoly of power ended in 2000. And that began a serious debate about reforming energy. But it took 3 presidencies later till the presidency of Peña Nieto that preceded today's AMLO that finally had the political will and the political muscle to make those reforms happen. And they weren't easy because they require a change to the Constitution to essentially privatize or even reform. But a significant energy reform package was put together in the prior government. And a couple of the most important changes involved the ability to pipe in natural gas from the United States, which has the cheapest natural gas in the world, to northern Mexico, where there's this lack of natural energy source, and the creation of, I think, 15 different significant sized, sort of utility sized natural gas powered generation plants. And also it allowed for private investment in things like pipelines and transmissions. But more importantly, it was in the generation field. We also had the advent of distributed generation, which is smaller scale generation plants that, say, an auto factory might invest in, and any excess electricity that it produces is not using, say, in the middle of the day or late at night, it can sell onto the grid at market prices. And that was absolute essential legal language to enable this private investment to invest. And they did. And over $50 billion was earmarked by different companies from the United States, Canada, Spain, Japan, et cetera, to build these plants and to build this infrastructure. But when AMLO came in, he was a guy who was reared politically in the 1970s when Pemex reigned large in Mexico. And he was supported by the unions in both of these organizations. And so he felt beholden to them. And he essentially kiboshed private initiative to generate and to distribute, putting it back squarely in the monopoly hands of CFE and Pemex. Now, that is what has caused the legal dispute with the Americans. It was a point of discussion when the leaders from the U.S., Canada, and Mexico met just a week ago in Mexico City. But it's an issue also that's going to be that even though there is a lot of pressure by American companies who've lost a lot of money to bring some sort of lawsuit against Mexico in the case of hoping them to change, there's a political reality on the ground, and that is that Biden is suffering from the image of lots of people crossing the Mexican-U.S. border sort of unfettered, and he's being blamed for that. And that is that hurt the Democrats in the midterm elections, and it is a real vulnerability to Biden's reelection next year. And essentially, in the hard knocks conversations that they had with AMLO in Mexico, coming from people we know who were in those meetings, basically AMLO said, if you want my help in policing the border, then you're going to have to let me have my way with my energy, my vision of Mexican energy, even if it runs contrary to the Mexican energy reforms that he inherited. So there's no sort of near-term solution to this. And there will be probably through internal pressures from Mexican companies, there will be continued investment in transmission. But just as an example, last year, transmission investment or capacity grew by about 0.5%, while electricity generation grew by 4%. That's a big gap, and it's putting increasing pressure on transmission. And these red spots show where insufficient transmission is causing a problem. And in conversations that I've had with real estate brokers who sell industrial space in northern Mexico, this is an issue for new investors looking to hook up their plots of land to the grid. So it's something you need to be careful, be aware of in terms of when you do your site selection. Make sure that there is ready access to transmission, to electricity. The other issue, and that has always plagued Mexico, of course, is violence. And it's tough to say if it's gotten worse in recent years, but the statistics here are not necessarily the stats that bother manufacturers. But in my experience with looking at statistics related to violence, homicide is the one statistic that is not lied about, is not underreported, and is not politically manipulated, whereas other ones might be. And as you can see, Mexico is a significantly more dangerous place than most of its, major manufacturing competitors, places like China, Vietnam, Turkey, Bangladesh, India, and even Nicaragua in Central America. As you can see on the map on the right, there is no consistency here. There is, and I must say that this map, which is written in 2019, will look different today. It is a constantly changing thing. A lot of it is driven by cartel violence. Now, cartels don't tend to target maquiladores or manufacturing sites themselves. However, the transportation vehicles that bring input goods and also assembled goods back to the border are sometimes targeted by cartels, as well as certain senior level people working in these plants can often be targeted. So it is an issue. Having lived in Mexico myself for 7 years, there's lots of ways to mitigate this. But the reality is that for certain cultures in certain countries, this level of violence and security risk is something they're just totally unaccustomed to. And so can be a bit of a tough sell versus a Vietnam, for instance. Now, when we look forward over a longer period of time, I just want to point out a couple of things that you should be aware of. First of all, the labor shortage that we're beginning to see in China, we will eventually see in Mexico as well. But for the next 20, 25 years, Mexico's younger population will continue to grow in age ranges that are still very employable in factories. And I think that that's important, because what we've learned is that most manufacturing in both China and Mexico is actually can be quite far removed from the biggest cities, the biggest urban population. So in Mexico, it tends to be along the border. In China, it is traditionally tended to be in the southeast part of the country, neither of which are the largest sources of population. So that meant that people moved there. Well, it's a lot easier to move when you're young and you're not married, you don't have kids, than it is when you're an older person. So the fact that an aging population is definitely making it tougher for factories in these areas to recruit and convince people to cross the country, give up their own family networks and work in these factories. The other thing is that in both these countries, but in particular China, the new workers must be digitally savvy and easily trainable with modern equipment, much of it digitally run. And there tends to be in both these countries a sort of ceiling age-wise as to when it's reasonable that you can train someone with modern equipment. And so again, the youthful workers tend to have an advantage here. They tend to be more adept at working in a modern manufacturing environment. And therefore, the age difference becomes that much more telling. Looking forward as to what kinds of goods Mexico traditionally and probably moving forward will continue to excel at. Mexico has two advantages that it brings to its manufacturing base. Number one, of course, is competitively priced labor. And the other is logistical proximity to the U.S., both many of its suppliers, as well as, of course, its customers. Now, those two together mean that products that tend to be heavier or larger, that have high logistics cost, as well as require more labor as opposed to energy, do well in Mexico. So that's cars. It's also meant parts, and also another up-and-coming area is the assembly of airplanes, trucks, and computers, especially especially like large screen TVs. The largest television assembly operations in the world are found in Baja California, close to Asian input suppliers by boat, and relatively cheap trucking into the United States. So this is where Mexico excels. Southern Asia has captured more and more of the knitted wear and clothing industry. China and Vietnam continue to excel in consumer electronics. And Turkey is similar to Mexico in that it's close to its customer base in Europe. And so therefore it tends to be excellent at the assembly of heavier vehicles. So that is we see this as a continued area of competitiveness for Mexico, and where the most likely industries that will continue to capture going forward. With that, I concluded my remarks, and I pass it back to Claire to start our live Q&A session.